The fifth edition of the Socialists and Democrats Africa Week. My name is Kelly Agathos, and we are live from the European Parliament in Brussels, where for the next week, representatives from Africa and Europe are meeting to discuss their progressive priorities ahead of the EU-Africa Summit. The focus this week is on fostering mutual knowledge and understanding between our two continents, because the Socialists and Democrats are committed to fostering a dialogue of equals for both our continents. You can watch live on socialistsandemocrats.eu and follow us with the hashtag #WithAfrica. So what can you expect from the next 2 days? We have a mix of political and cultural events. We will hear from representatives of civil society, culture, the private sector, and of course politics. People like Bobi Wine, the opposition leader in Uganda, Dr. Ayoyade Olatsobun Alakia, who is the co-chair of Africa Union's Vaccine Delivery Alliance, as well as our own commissioners Jutta Urpilainen and Elena Dali. We will have events, we will have plays, an exhibition, as well as panels on infrastructure, digital activism, democracy, and climate change. So it's going to be a very exciting 2 days ahead. But before we get into all that, I'd like to give the floor to the President of the Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament, Irache Garcia. Welcome, Irache.
Thank you. Dear friends, thank you very much for making this exceptional exchange of progressive voices possible. Let me express my gratitude to those colleagues involved in the preparation of the fifth edition of our Africa Week. I would also like to welcome and thank all the progressive leaders, activists and civil society representatives that will participate in our debates over the next 3 days. More than ever, it is time for progressive in Europe and Africa to join forces and lead the change the world needs. Europe and Africa face similar change. This is why the Africa Week represents an extraordinary platform to build common response to global challenges such as the climate emergency, the digital transformation, gender equality, migration, international trade based on fair rules, the UN Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the fight against tax havens. The pandemic has deeply affected our two continents. The only solution to overcome its dramatic health, social and economic consequences is vaccination. We need equitable access to vaccines for everyone, everywhere. Unfortunately, we are still very far from achieving this goal, especially in Africa. Let me be clear. Vaccines must be made for Africa, in Africa and by Africa. This is why Social Democrats are engaged with patent waivers as the only way forward to speed up vaccination in Africa. The pandemic has also increased inequalities across the world. We fully support the actions undertaken within the framework of the G20 to reduce the debt of our African partners. However, this is not enough. All creditors must play their part. We also want to cooperate closely with Africa in the fight against climate change. It is well known that most of the African countries that emit few greenhouse gases are the most affected by climate change. The European Union must help Africa to adapt its consequences. The Great Green Wall against the certification project is a step in the right direction. Africa and Europe must combine their efforts to make a COP27 in Egypt a success. The digital transition can also accelerate economic development if we promote the inclusion of all, especially in rural areas. Young people should be the key drivers of the green and digital transition. This is why the education they receive and their participation in the political life of our countries is central important. Peace and security are also essential pillars of our partnership. We will only achieve a lasting peace if good governance is the head of our policies. For this reason, we need the support, the fight against corruption, the respect of human rights and the rule of law, the return of public service and economic development. If we want to deepen the partnership between the European Union and Africa, we should we should go beyond the political and economic issues. Culture must become a key part of our partnership. Culture touches people's heart and promotes our values such as respect of human rights, solidarity, and protection of those who are in danger. We need to listen to each other. A real partnership must be a two-way conversation. I also hope to hear many women voices in our Africa Week, because we cannot leave every important decision to half of the population. Its voices deserve to be heard. Together, we continue to raise our voices in the streets and its public institution until we achieve a full gender equality and put an end to all sorts of violence against women, the end of feminicide, and the respect for sexual and reproductive health, as well as the protection of LGBTI rights, must become a reality. As a Spaniard, I am aware of how close we are. We are neighbors and natural partners. I hope that the 5th edition of the Africa Week can bring a positive contribution to the upcoming European Union-African Union Summit. In a world where the democratic values of which both the African Union and European Union were founded are under threat, we need to develop a true partnership that guarantees progress for our citizens. In building our partnership, we must always remember what Nelson Mandela said. It is in your hands to create a better world for all who live in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Irache. We are also joined by Pedro Marques, who is the Vice President for the Socialist and Democrat Group and the leader in Foreign Affairs. So please, Pedro, hello, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kathy. Irache, Udo, dear friends, our viewers, online viewers from our two continents and from all over the world. We are honored, obviously, and grateful to host the Africa Week once more as part of our commitment to a shared path between Africa and Europe. And I am obviously particularly thankful to all our team that organized and made this event possible. We will once more define the best way forward for our continents and send a message to influence and persuade others and other leaders as well of our proposals, and that they are the best way to proceed for a mutually beneficial relation between Africa and the EU. We do not only host this event for the EU-Africa Intergovernmental Summit or their participants. We do it for the whole world to get our progressive view on the best ideas and the key issues affecting the world and our two continents. The relations between Africa and the EU will get renewed attention during the next few weeks. But you know well that for the progressives, this is not something that we remember every now and then, a few months in a particular year. No, we are committed permanently as one of our priorities in terms of external policy. In times in which the regional powers are clashing all over the world, if Europe wants to stand up and wants to be heard, Europe has to go back to where we are stronger. And certainly our partnership with Africa has always made us stronger in the world. Irache already referred to the importance of the challenge of inequalities in Africa, not just within the continent, but also between the continent and the rest of the world. We will recognize that the challenges in Africa are certainly connected to the issues of inequality and exclusion. We referred, for instance, and Irache already did, to the issue of the recovery from the pandemic crisis. We speak about these issues, inequalities, the recovery from the pandemic, the infrastructures, the digital challenge. We see that the world is differently equipped when we think about tackling such challenges. And responding to these challenges in a solidar manner is not just about an ethical response from Europe. It's also in our own interest, as we have seen in the response to the pandemic. From our side in Europe, we now have global Europe. So we have a program for the development of the partnership with the rest of the world, and particularly with Africa in these next few years. We have the resources. We need to translate those resources into concrete action. That is also what we will be discussing in this Africa Week with all of you. We should be able to translate those messages, those priorities into action, be it in the acceleration of the implementation of the continental free trade area, the stabilization of the least developed regions, the response to the pandemic. Some form of action which we can credit to the Africa Week initiative is expected and will be cherished certainly by the participants. I look forward to the fruitful discussions and thank you in advance for your participation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pedro. And of course, we have the coordinator of the S&D Africa Week with us. We have Udo Buhlmann here. Hello, Udo. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you, Kelly. My colleagues have already mentioned it. It's the 5th year in which the Socialists and Democrats carry through but also celebrate this Africa Week, because for us it's of a special importance. What is the special thing about the Socialists and Democrats Africa Week? There's a whole lot of panels everywhere on the globe, but you can read it from our motto, from our leitmotif this year, that is named From Discourse to Action. We are the ones to make it happen. So we are going to meet our friends, not only politicians. Of course, we have commissioners here. Kelly mentioned it. We have key players from the national scene. We have African politicians. Bobby Wine is one of the most prominent, already arrived yesterday. We welcome him a lot. But we have especially, first and foremost, the young generation with us. That is important. The young generation is going to shape the continents in Europe as well as in Africa, of course. And that is of a major importance for our program. Civic society, we have business people, entrepreneurs from the ground, artists, journalists, academics. So it will be a very, very vivid event. And a vivid event 1 week before a very crucial meeting. The meeting of the heads of states and government from the African Union as well as from the European Union. And our message is clear. When, if not now? We have to make this partnership on equal footing, as we say always, happen now. It was already raised by my colleagues. Health crises are in the middle, in the focus of our debate. That is natural that we have to support our friends, and that the pandemic has to be ended as soon as possible. But we also need a health infrastructure for the forthcoming crisis, a global one, and we need Africa on board with all its resources. We have sustainable welfare as a common vision, the 2030 agenda of the United Nations. And what we can do, we can develop a vision in which Africa and the European Union are going to become the leaders, the key actors for this sustainable transformation, because Africa is a whole rich continent, young generation, young people, renewable energies, resources, plenty of good ideas to rebuild better, to reshape our economic life and our social contracts in our societies. Fighting inequalities, as Irache and Pedro said rightly, is on top of our agenda, and building a sustainable economy, a welfare-oriented sustainable development to the benefit of all. If you would like to achieve that, you also have to overcome the debt threat that has been mentioned already. We appeal to the rich nations on the globe to take action immediately so that we can kickstart African economies right after we have overcome the pandemic. Last but not least, it's also fun to tune in because we also have cultural events. It's panels, it's debates, but it's also music. It's dialogue, it's artists. Cultural night tonight, for instance, I'm looking very much forward. We have a digital exhibition that shows how our communities could look in Africa tomorrow. using all the intelligence, all the creativity that is in the African nations. And I, again, also as my colleagues, thank a lot Rose Bagudu, all the team who have prepared this excellent event. Looking forward to meeting you. See you, and thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Udo. Thank you, all of you, for being here for the opening of SND's 5th edition of its Africa Week. You heard about it from us already. We will have a very rich and varied program, a lot of culture, a focus on youth, sustainability, equality, a partnership of equals, passing from discussion to action. So join us. Stay tuned on socialistsanddemocrats.eu. Follow us with the hashtag #WithAfrica. We will be back in just a short few moments for our first panel on bridging the generation gap, advancing democracy for inclusion and sustainable governance between Africa and Europe. Thank you, and see you very soon.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this first session of the first day of the Africa Week 2022, promoted by the European Socialists and Democrats. My name is Amara Wampa, and we are live from the European Parliament in Brussels, Belgium. I will be moderating this session today, and I will be engaging with not only the speakers who I will invite to speak very soon, but with all of you following the conversation online. If you would like to make a contribution, kindly drop your comment using the appropriate feature on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. In this session, we will explore how we can bridge the generational gap of leadership in Africa and advance innovative and sustainable governance. We'll also examine how a transformational partnership with our continental neighbors, Europe, can facilitate this aspiration. Africa boasts of the most youthful and vibrant population globally. It is by far the youngest continent on the globe and is set to remain so for the next 30 years. According to the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, about 70% of the continent's population is under the age of 30, and more than a third are between the ages of 15 and 34. By 2100, Africa's youth population could be equivalent to twice Europe's entire population. However, the profile of our leaders on the continent is not representative of this youthful population. The average age of the African head of state is, as of 2018, was 64.5 years old, compared to 19.7, which is the average median age of the population. This 44-year gap is the largest in the world and symbolic of the generational divide between Africa and its leaders. Aspiration 6 of the AU Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, emphasizes an Africa whose development is people-driven, relying on the potential offered by all African people, especially its women and youth. Africa cannot solve its 21st century challenges relying solely on 20th century minds. We must work together across generations to build countries of our dreams. Therefore, I'm curious to learn from our very knowledgeable speakers here, and from some of you, those of you who are joining us online, how Africa can harness this incredible youth power to become globally competitive, and how citizens can work together across generations to give young people more opportunities to contribute meaningfully to national, regional, and continental development. Now, let me introduce our speakers. Would have Ms. Jutta Urpilainen, who is the EU Commissioner for International Partnerships. Unfortunately, she's not able to join us today, so she's recorded a video message which we will play. We have Mr. Honorable Robert Kyagulanyi Sentamu, who we popularly know as Bobi Wine. He's a Ugandan opposition leader. He's a musician. He's an activist and also a former member of parliament. Would be Ms. Anita Nkirote will also be joining us online. She's a member of the Youth Senate in Kenya, and she's also a policy analyst. Would also have Mr. We wouldn't be having Mr. Nelson, but would have Ms. Aisha Traore, who's from the IUCN, Global Protected and Conserved Area Program. Would be having Mr. Eric Andreu, who's an S&D member of parliament and member of the Committee on Development. Mr. Manji Wilson will also be joining us online. He's a governance policy and election expert. He's also a Mo Ibrahim Now Generation Forum cohort of 2021. He's from Nigeria. Now, I would like us to take the video message from Ms. Jutta Urpilainen.
Dear friends, I would like to be with you in person today, but I am on my way to Senegal, preparing for the upcoming EU-AU summit. We continue consulting on our Africa strategy and its partnerships with an enhanced focus on human development. the S&D Africa Week has grown into a crucial event to promote a new partnership with our sister continent. Like you, I want the summit to break new ground, to lay the foundation for an ambitious partnership between Africa and Europe. Good governance and respect for democratic principles are an essential part of our collaboration. We need strong democratic institutions to ensure that everyone has a voice and the rights of all are protected. Team Europe is the biggest donor of democracy support in the world. Over the next 7 years, we will finance these efforts in at least 46 sub-Saharan countries. This includes concrete programs to empower youth. For example, our Young African Leaders program is a fellowship that trains young women and men to become Africa's future leaders. Involving young people in decision-making is key to transforming our societies for the better. Youth are at the heart of my work, and I actively reach out to youth groups and civil society organizations for their input. This is why I established a youth sounding board to accompany my decision-making process, as well as country-level boards in some of our EU delegations. They are a platform for young people to influence the EU's policies abroad. Young leaders, you are the drivers of change, the key to building resilient democracies. The EU fully supports you, and I wish you a successful Africa Week.
Very insightful remarks from Ms. Yuta. Very strong comments and partnerships between Europe and Africa, and raising young African leaders and strengthening the voice of young people across the continent. She's made very important points about how important involving young people in decision-making creates strong and progressive societies. I wonder if I can hear from Anita at the moment, Miss Anita Nkirote. Despite young Africans making a disproportionate majority of the population in Africa, some of the aspirations has been expressed by Ms. Yuta earlier, are not fully realized. Young people are not on the tables of decision-making and not adequately represented in governance structures. Why do you think this is so? Why are we having this problem in Africa, Anita? Okay, so I don't think we have Anita yet. We will come back to her later. So I'm just going to turn to someone I have here in the studio, Bobby Wine. As an opposition leader and a former member of the parliament, what would you say are the political and economic barriers that prevent young Africans from formal political participation in your country and maybe even for the rest of Africa? And how have you been able to surmount them?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Greetings, viewers. I'll talk about Africa largely, but allow me to zoom in to Eastern Africa, and more particularly to Uganda, where I live. The challenges of Africa, Uganda in particular, is a generational divide, which is not only in age, but is also in mentality. And I'm very glad that you mentioned it, that we are stuck with 20th century mentality and leaders, and yet we are largely a 21st century population. We are stuck with leaders that have an old mentality and a mentality of authoritarianism. In Uganda, the problem, and I believe largely in Africa, is authoritarianism, where we have a leader that has been in power for 36 years. Unfortunately, even when the voices are raised, they are ignored or squashed with brutality. Now, this is a challenge. How we've been able to surmount them, I would not really be quick to say we've surmounted them. We've made the efforts, but the efforts have been crushed. And unfortunately, the development partners are not innocent to this. We really appreciate the attention that is put on Africa, but the attention and the statements alone do not cut the result. It is the action that we desire, and when that action, when that partnership is put in action, I strongly believe that Africa will be where it really deserves to be. I really believe that Africans, especially young Africans, will live to their full potential.
Thank you, Bobby Wine, for those very strong thoughts. The challenge of authoritarianism, and this is also, this goes hand in hand with a disappointment in governance from young people. I think it was a 2019 Mo Ibrahim Forum report that found that 60% of African, especially young people, think that their governments are doing a very bad job, or a fairly bad job, at addressing the needs of young people. I think in response to some of these authoritarianism trends in Africa, we've seen since 2010, a wave of peaceful protests across the continent. So my next question will go to Isa. It appears young Africans are speaking, especially, as Bobby Wine said earlier, but the governments are not listening. The leaders, the older generation are not listening to them. Why is the African youth voice not making a significant difference in governance? Why is it not being creating change despite the numbers that we have? Okay, we don't have Aisha, so I would ask you, Bobby, again to weigh in on this one.
Well, thank you very much. Africa has significantly suffered an attack on democracy and democratic principles. It has suffered an attack on human rights. It has suffered an attack on the rule of law. And like I said, while the authoritarian leaders in Africa are having their field day crushing democracy and crushing any alternative voices, particularly the young voices, it has not been made better by the development partners. I'm of the view that if the world listened and indeed acted to the values that bring us together as humanity, then Africa would live its full potential.
Thank you. We're looking at how Africa can live its full potential, but unfortunately, I don't think we can if we don't bridge this generational divide. But young people, have their own responsibility in this. Sure. And I think I would ask Ms. Kesani, if she's joined us, to address this issue, because despite being very vocal on social issues online, most young people dominate conversations on politics on Twitter, on Facebook, and on all various social media platforms. But I'm conspicuously missing on election day. Why is that so, and what can be done for youth numbers to count in the polls and in the elections?
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. So this is rather a very subjective question to really ask, because my voice doesn't necessarily represent the youth at large. But as someone, as a young person in South Africa who did not take part in the local government elections late November last year, we predominantly don't go to the polling stations because no matter what we say or what we fight for or the concerns we raise on social media, nothing changes. There is no youth representation in our government, right? And when I'm talking about youth representation, I'm talking about people that actually have the power and the influence, right, to change policies and decisions in our government. So representation is lacking so much. Our government has a tendency of doing things as tick box exercises. They will try and enact transformation policies or policies of any kind to ensure that they look like they are adhering to international standards, whereas they're actually not. And as someone that works in informal settlements, which are reached by poverty and inequality, nothing has changed. It's been 28 years into democracy, but people in informal settlements are still complaining or trying to get water and sanitation, just basic service delivery. So why should we as young people actually vote? I decide to not vote because it's not that I'm oppressed or I'm not allowed to vote, but it's a decision that I take as an individual to not vote. I take not voting as a protest of some sort that hopefully our government would use this time before the national elections in 2024 to actually reassess and reevaluate what's happening. Youth unemployment is very high. We've actually reached about 70% of youth unemployment in South Africa. Corruption continues to go up. No representation, no accountability, nothing actually works. So the youth is just being used as a tick box exercise, but we're actually not being put in positions of power, positions of influence, especially if you do not actually adhere to political standards in South Africa. If you speak out loud, you'll actually be excluded. So I think us not playing an active role in all of this is actually due to the fact that nobody listens. Nobody listens. So for how long are we going to protest? For how long are we going to withdraw our votes? So I think it's a good time now, especially for South Africa, leading up to the national elections in 2024, for them to actually reassess and have proper public participation, consultations with the youth, and actually ask, what is it that we want? Whatever approach they need to have needs to have a people-centered approach, which actually takes everything into consideration when they actually enact policy to ensure that we regain our faith and actually believe in everything that they're actually telling us or promising us, for that matter.
Thank you, Ms. Kesani, for those comments. I'm just wondering, how, we're going to press for change if we are despondent, because I can hear a bit of despondence in her voice, and it's understandable, having shouted at the top of your voice and not been heard. There's a temptation to disconnect from the system. But let's hear a bit from our European partners here, and I would like to ask Eric, who's also joining us online, about this situation, how it's been experienced in Europe. Is not online?
Eric is with us. Yes, I'm here.
Oh my God, Eric. I'm so sorry.
No problem.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So Eric, I'm glad I have you here, because I've lost a lot of my online speakers, but you're here, and I'm happy you are. And you've been listening to this conversation we've been having about Africa and the generational gap. And I just want to have your take on, how Europe experiences different from Africa, and how, Europe is building capacity for young people to co-create solutions and co-lead with the older generation. And what lessons have you learned?
Merci d'abord de m'avoir accueilli, donc voilà, non pas virtuellement mais physiquement, donc et merci de cette invitation à cette discussion qui est essentielle pour l'Afrique, mais qui est également essentielle, je crois, pour tous les continents et aussi le continent européen. Moi, je suis un nouveau membre de la commission DV au Parlement européen, et je vais certainement m'exprimer avec beaucoup de naïveté. Et je préfère le dire en préalable à mes propos. Mais ce que j'observe d'abord, c'est que la question des jeunes et de l'intergénération est une question, bien sûr africaine, et je vais y revenir, mais qui est une question aussi européenne. Ce que vous ressentez à l'Afrique, peut-être à un degré moindre, mais on le ressent aussi donc, au niveau européen. Et moi, je suis français, vous l'entendez, et ce qui est vrai pour l'Europe est aussi vrai pour la France. C'est-à-dire qu'on a du mal à permettre aux jeunes de participer de la vie publique et de participer de la prise de responsabilité. Et en France, tout simplement, il y a une étude qui vient d'être réalisée là, il y a quelques jours et qui montre ô combien le désintérêt des jeunes pour la chose publique et la chose politique. Et je crois que les causes en sont peut-être à un degré moindre, mais les mêmes à la fois au niveau européen et français et à la fois au niveau africain. Et je m'explique. Finalement, je pense que la réponse, elle est à la fois dans l'approche qui a été donnée par Bobby Wine, je me permets de vous appeler comme ça, et à la fois par Madame Kesani, qui vient d'en parler à l'instant. C'est-à-dire que je pense que en Europe et en France, ça manque, j'ai envie de dire, d'espace de parole et d'écoute de la jeunesse. très clairement. Mais en Afrique, c'est encore plus difficile, parce que je pense que vous venez de pointer la question qui me paraît essentielle, c'est la question du mode de gouvernance et de la légitimité finalement d'une forme de démocratie que les organisations internationales ont validée ces dernières années. Et effectivement, ça vient d'être dit avec force par Mme Kessani, si la jeunesse africaine n'est pas écoutée, ne se retrouve pas dans les décisions publiques qui sont prises, ben, elle ne peut pas s'investir. Je dirais, dans les modes d'action. Et c'est un sujet qui pose certes la question de la jeunesse, mais au préalable pose la question de la démocratie, légitime ou illégitime, et du mode de gouvernance. Et je pense qu'avant de construire des partenariats, il paraît important que les organisations internationales posent la question au plus haut niveau, je dirais, de la conscience. Vous avez tout à l'heure parlé de sens, et ça me paraît important si on veut avancer sur le partenariat. J'ai presque envie de dire, peut-être il nous appartiendrait à tous, autant que nous sommes, de réinventer finalement, de façon contemporaine, ce que vous connaissez bien et ce que j'aime bien connaître, bon, dans tous les cas, ici et ailleurs, c'est cette notion d'arbre à parole, quoi. Peut-être qu'il faut inventer l'arbre à palabre ou à parole jeune, spécifique, mais avec une volonté forte, donc d'écouter et de créer le lien entre des générations qui ont l'expérience et des générations qui ont l'énergie. Il faut créer des espaces de parole et d'écoute. Si les jeunes ne sont pas, comment dire, écoutés et entendus, ils ne peuvent pas participer à la vie publique. Et donc ça veut dire que ça pose des questions à plusieurs niveaux. Un, je le redis, la légitimité des pouvoirs en place. Et ça nous interroge dans nos partenariats. Deux, la question de l'écoute, parce que les jeunes aujourd'hui sont dans l'attente de résultats concrets dans leur quotidien. Or, ce n'est pas ce qui se produit, surtout en Afrique, mais également au niveau européen ou au niveau de nos différents États. Donc je pense que la question paraît simple, mais elle est complexe parce qu'elle embrasse une vision totalement globale du point de vue politique, holistique, nous dirions ici, donc à Bruxelles où nous sommes. Et je pense que c'est intéressant de construire, c'est-à-dire qu'au-delà de l'écoute, on sait bien les leviers. Il y a les leviers sociaux. Lorsqu'on parle d'autonomisation de jeunesse, ça parlera par une approche sociale, par une approche culturelle, par une approche économique. Mais si dès le départ, les jeux sont faussés, on ne peut pas participer de la lutte contre la pauvreté. On ne peut pas participer de l'émancipation, de l'éducation, de l'accès à la culture, à la connaissance, au savoir. On ne peut pas participer de l'accès à l'emploi. On ne peut pas participer de l'accès à l'activité. Il y a des outils, il y a des leviers pour permettre à ce que les jeunes soient partie prenante de la vie démocratique, mais il y a un préalable, c'est qu'il faut que la vie démocratique soit réellement démocratique et que les pouvoirs en place ne s'adressent pas à quelques-uns, mais s'adressent au plus grand nombre. Et peut-être ce qui exacerbe la situation africaine, c'est le fait, et vous l'avez dit dans vos propos introductifs, que 70% de la population africaine a moins de 30 ans. Et de ce fait, ça amplifie le phénomène, mais je pense qu'il y a des questions qu'il faut appréhender à plusieurs niveaux. Un, l'enjeu démocratique, la légitimité, et de deux, l'enjeu des outils à mettre en œuvre pour participer de l'économie, du volet social et du volet culturel. Donc c'est ce qui me paraît être la base d'un nouveau type de partenariat, tel que ça a été énoncé par notre commissaire. Donc, si on veut demain pouvoir participer d'une réciprocité en matière de développement.
Thank you, Mr. Eric, for such insightful contributions, especially the contribution that recommends that we have specific forums for young people to express themselves, spaces created within our democracies for young people to actually have a voice. And I think this is a very strong recommendation that we'll probably be discussing a bit later as we look at how to mainstream the youth voice. But it's also important that, you know, some of the institutional restrictions that are there to prevent young people from participating in the mainstream conversations, that those institutional or procedural spaces are opened up. And I'm going to ask Manji, who's from Nigeria, to tell us a bit more about this. In Nigeria, we had the Not Too Young to Run youth-led movement, which was supported across Nigeria and actually received support from the EU as well. It successfully lowered the age of of contestants to allow young people to be able to contest for office. Before then, of course, we had age limits to contesting for office and completely excluded young people from being able to hold national offices. But that has changed constitutionally in Nigeria, and that's as a result of youth political action. So Manji, are you aware of any other success stories of young people forcing themselves into the room and making sure that their voices are heard?
Thank you very much, Amara, for this question and an interesting discussion that is quite needed at the moment. Indeed, in response to your question about the movements that are being generated across, Africa, I think it is important to state, what some of the issues, are the dimensions to the scope of this issue. You had highlighted the issue of the leadership in terms of age and the gap between the average age of leadership today and the young population in Africa. But you also know that the World Bank and the UNFPA data has projected that by 2050, the current 1 billion population in Africa would be nearing 2.5 billion, with more than half of that population younger than 25 years. This is indeed reflective of some of the issues that have been highlighted, especially what Ken Sani was also talking about earlier, because we have a great, demographic shift across the continent, as well as an increase in digital communications, which has sort of galvanized, social activism and movement for young people. This you could also triangulate to specific examples that you're trying to highlight with the Not Too Young to Run movement in Nigeria. But there are other similar movements across Africa being coordinated, like in Zambia, we saw for their multi-party elections where young people galvanized and mobilized and turned out en masse, becoming more than 70%, of the voters on E-Day to cast their votes and make their voices heard. The Siasia place in Kenya has been doing, an amazing work. You can also see that while we have some of these positive efforts, you see the fees must fall, conversation in South Africa, the Yen Amari, movement in Senegal as well, which has been trying to serve as a means for young people to engage, their government interlocutors, because I think this is all about a conversation around, a place for everyone to be a part of the key decision processes of ensuring that governance work. Essentially, like you've mentioned, I think the link between, governance, and elections that Ken Sani was talking about, as a means of, airing the voices that we are not happy, considering what is being done in terms of governance management, needs to be strengthened. The issues of social economic rights, the issue of provision of not just social safety nets, but economic opportunities, education, unemployment numbers being addressed, and certain issues that also promote migration, insecurity, and there are quite a barrage of issues. So this is not just about, a conversation on being on the table, but looking at the holistic development of the population of Africa, especially the young population. The young population is getting to a point where there is articulation of a common voice, on issues that borders on the development of the young person. And I think it is quite critical, and it is exciting to see that the European Union, beyond the commitments, of course, as mentioned by Commissioner Obilanen, talking about the Youth Sounding Board and other platforms, the African Young Leaders Program that is being promoted, that there are quite a number of efforts, even on the African continent, talking about mentorship programs, internships, that could also afford young people an opportunity to not just air their voices, but to also practice some of these methods of leading, the population of Africa into, a particular platform or level that they intend to. So I think these are the issues that are really, generating a lot of the movements that you're seeing across the continent of Africa, beyond the Arab Spring that started, early a couple of years back. These are just very, very critical issues, foundational and fundamental, that need to be given, critical attention to ensure that this partnership that is being envisioned and promoted within the next 7 years between Europe and Africa, yields, very positive results.
Thank you, Mr. Manji, for that very detailed intervention. Highlighting the fact that not just political action in terms of getting in the room, but there has to be a holistic view of what you are going to do when you get in the room. That leads me to the next question, which I'm going to ask Bobby Wine. About how, you have experience in political organizing, and from your experience as an opposition leader and a former member of parliament, what can you share about how some of the young political and social activists we're seeing rise all across Africa? What can you share from your experience about how they can organize their collective agitations into effective political structures that can have impact on election day?
Thank you very much. I've been listening to the submissions of various people, and I kind of have a feeling that I wish I was from those areas. Well, I speak from a rather peculiar view. I come from a country which is probably the youngest population in the world, Uganda, where we have more than 85% under the age of 35. And indeed, for the last 4 years, we have been banking on that, looking at that young population. We don't look at it as a liability. We look at it as a resource, especially if it's galvanized, if it's called upon to, come together and make a decision together. And that was a reason why we started what we call the People Power Movement in Uganda, to call upon young people to get involved in the decision-making and then in the political dispensation of their country. And indeed, we were able to call upon young people who turned out in millions to vote to decide their destiny. Now, the challenge here is, unlike many other places, what is the response of the authorities? As I speak right now, we have thousands of young people in Uganda rotting in torture chambers, rotting in jails. Why? Because they raised their voices non-violently to say they want a leader of their generation. Like I mentioned, we have a military leader in Uganda, and I believe many other places in Africa, but particularly in Uganda, we have a leader that has been in power for 36 years, who came to power by use of arms, and indeed has used arms and force to crush all voices of dissent. We went to the polls in January last year, and people turned out massively to vote. Unfortunately, the internet was blacked out. The European Union and United States election observers were blocked from the country. I was a presidential candidate, but by the time we went to the polls, I was under military detention in my house. So this scenario makes every thought impossible. It makes all the ideas impossible. Now, being on this platform, I will also raise it that the international community is not innocent to this. While young Africans have aspirations and indeed have dreams for Africa, while they are first world brains stuck largely in third world countries, they have thoughts, they have aspirations, they want to transform Africa because they see what other young people are doing in the rest of the world. But because we have authoritarianism, which I don't tire to emphasize, then everything, every thought, all the intelligent ideas tend to hit a block wall. And like I mentioned, being on this platform, the international community is not innocent to that. Of course, the young Africans appreciate the voices that are raised by the international community in terms of statements. But the fact that the international community pours lots of money in terms of aid to Africa without following it up with calling upon the authorities in Africa, and in particular in Uganda, to ensure that it is not just business, but it is the values, the democratic values, the values of the respect of the rule of law, the values of human rights, then we are only going to be talking about this. young Africans know where they want to go. They envision a future, but they are stuck in a world where they are crushed with brute force. Now, this is the elephant in the room that I believe we must address. Other than that, we are only going to be looking at the promised land where we want to go as Africa, but we won't be able to move our footsteps to reach it because we cannot fight against the American dollars. We cannot fight against the Italian bullets. We cannot fight against the donations from the European Union that are just placed in Africa, and they're siphoned and are used in patronage and crushing of voices of dissent. Like I mentioned, right now, as I speak, I'm only maybe able to leave the country because I have international focus on me. But thousands, hundreds of thousands of young people are rotting in torture chambers and in prisons in Uganda. Why? Because they dared to challenge the authority of the strong men, in particular General Museveni, who has been in power for 36 years. Now, this is a case in many African countries. And until the world, until the international community, in particular the European Union, until they address that, until they call to order those authorities, until they make democracy, real democracy, a precondition for cooperation, we are going to be moving in circles. But when we have an opportunity for the international community to say, no, we are not going to be part of the criminality, then the voices of young Africans are going to count. Like I said, I really envy the young people in other countries that just decide not to vote. In Uganda, we actually long for the voting, and we line up the entire day to vote, but our votes don't count.
Thank you, Bobby. Yeah, I'm actually very proud of the resilience of the Ugandan youth to continue to push their case through the process, even though there's, as you said, there's a lot of effort to make sure that that doesn't count. And you also mentioned that this is the case across many African countries. I wouldn't disagree with you, but I'd love to hear from other speakers as well. And Aisha is online, and I'd like her to weigh in on this. I don't even need to cite this, but during the Virtual African Union Youth Consultation Series in June 2020, that was during the pandemic, young Africans who gathered around to discuss the state of governance in Africa, they highlighted in many instances, many countries, this disconnect between young people and their governments leading to distrust and a disconnection. And you know, it's even obvious in the frustration I hear from Bobby Wine here in the studio, who's talking about the fact that we are now looking outside our government, outside our processes, to see how our voices can impact our country. And so I'd like to ask you, Aisha, if you agree with that, if that's your experience, and if you can cite any other examples, so you know the audience know that this is not just a Ugandan situation. And have we learned any lessons? Is there any lessons for all of the stakeholders? Young people, have we learned anything from this encounter? Have our governments learned anything? Has the international community learned anything from this experience that we've had in the continent? Aisha, over to you.
Thank you. I will speak in French. Then,
pas de problème.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup pour l'opportunité et cet espace de l'Africa Week que j'ai aujourd'hui de vraiment m'exprimer en tant que jeune. Je suis beaucoup une exception pour beaucoup de jeunes parce que des jeunes africaines comme moi qui ont accès à cet espace, qui ont accès à l'éducation, qui ont accès à des tables de décision sont vraiment très rares. En 2016, il y a la fondation Mo Ibrahim qui a révélé un rapport. Vous savez, l'âge moyen des présidents africains était de 66 ans, tandis que l'âge médian des jeunes sur le continent, de la population, je dirais même, est de 20 ans. Alors, il y a vraiment un gap 66 à 20 ans. Dans cette logique, il est très facile d'oublier que les jeunes d'aujourd'hui sont les adultes de demain. Ils ont été les enfants d'hier, mais ce sont eux réellement qui vont décider, ils seront les aînés de demain. Donc, il n'est vraiment pas judicieux de compartimenter leur participation au progrès de la société et sans tenir compte des possibilités que la société peut offrir à chacun. Vous savez, on ne reste pas jeune éternellement, on a aussi des aspirations. La jeunesse aussi a besoin d'être écoutée. Et je vais aussi venir sur cette figure que d'ici 2025, une personne sur 4 dans le monde aura moins de 25 ans et sera en Afrique. Alors, cela signifie que les dirigeants d'aujourd'hui doivent se concentrer sur la construction d'un continent avec résilience, avec des projets de développement durable pour que nous qui sommes les jeunes d'aujourd'hui devenons des adultes de demain. Nous soyons responsables. On a besoin d'un partenariat intergénérationnel, d'un co-leadership, d'avoir une place à la table, d'être des adultes responsables, mais aussi d'apprendre. On ne peut pas apprendre en étant dans la rue. On ne peut pas apprendre en étant toujours stigmatisé. Parce qu'il y a aujourd'hui une barrière à la participation des jeunes au progrès, mais aussi aux décisions, aux lois. Et dès qu'on entend jeune, on ne tient pas compte du fait que oui, on peut faire des erreurs. On a le droit de faire des erreurs parce qu'on doit apprendre. Ça doit être une transition de la phase jeunesse à la phase adulte. Au cours de la décennie dernière, on a un déclin de l'engagement politique des jeunes qui a été un sujet de préoccupation pour tout le monde. Ils ne vont pas voter et on pense que c'est en étant dans la rue que les jeunes peuvent participer parce que ça, c'est la voie qu'ils ont trouvée pour se faire entendre. L'idée même de promouvoir la participation des jeunes est devenue tellement populaire dans les discours des gouvernements et des organisations. Maintenant, on se rend compte que c'est plus le discours. Le discours doit cesser. Il doit avoir vraiment des actes attribués aux jeunes pour leur donner l'espace, pour leur donner la possibilité de parler. Et ce manque d'intérêt des jeunes à participer est aussi vu comme c'est des gens qui n'ont pas d'intérêt. Mais non, on ne peut pas ne pas leur donner l'espace et ne pas leur permettre de participer avec des moyens parce qu'ils sont que dans les discours. Mais si on arrive à les engager, à les amener avec un partenariat intergénérationnel, à faire une transition entre l'âge jeunesse et l'âge adulte avec des moyens plus conviviaux, moins bureaucratiques, je dirais dans mon langage de jeune, et aussi efficace parce qu'on a besoin de ça aujourd'hui. On voit comment ça se passe sur le continent. Et je l'ai dit, l'âge médian des présidents est de 66 et l'âge médian de la population est de 20 ans. Alors, il y a une grande barrière. Il y a une transition qu'on doit maintenant penser à mettre en œuvre. On peut affirmer que le système doit vraiment essayer de discuter avec ces jeunes, de les amener avec eux et de ne pas leur laisser de côté parce que la rue ne sera jamais la solution. On ne peut pas engager quelqu'un en le laissant de côté en disant qu'il n'est pas intéressé. Il y a un manque d'intérêt. Il est aussi pas nécessaire d'élaborer des politiques et des projets si les espaces sécurisés ne sont pas mis en œuvre, si les choses ne font qu'offrir de fausses confiances. Je dis fausse confiance parce qu'on utilise les jeunes pour les campagnes, on les utilise pour des activités. Mais après, lorsque les leaders sont à leur place, lorsqu'ils ont tenu beaucoup de promesses, les jeunes ne voient pas ce qui se passe, ils ne voient pas les promesses tenues. Et c'est comme ça qu'ils se retrouvent seuls. Il y a le manque d'intérêt. Il faut vraiment créer ces espaces sécurisés. Les politiques doivent être inclusives pour tout le monde, en particulier pour les jeunes. On doit être ensemble. L'autre point de vue est qu'en Afrique, le fardeau de l'inexpérience signifie que les jeunes sont écartés de toutes les activités. Mais le droit d'être jeune, c'est le droit à l'erreur. C'est le droit à l'inexpérience. C'est le droit aussi à l'apprentissage. C'est le droit d'être pris en compte. C'est le droit d'être accompagné pour être le responsable de demain. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Aisha, for that. It was a broad take, but highlighting the issue of transition and the transition gap, and the gap that we have to bridge in transition between generations is not just an age gap, but there's a learning gap, there's an education gap, there's a capacity building gap, and we should keep that in mind. And this is important, and I like the fact that the young people on this panel are setting the agenda for the continent and how this transition should happen. And for me, I think that also young people should manage this transition. They know what they want to see, want to experience in the future. And some of these policy recommendations about how this transition should happen, appear very sound. But I'm going to turn to Eric now and ask, because a lot of the speakers on this panel have highlighted the role of the international community. And I think that the international community plays a role in empowering young people. Just ask how the international community can step in on these issues, some of these issues that have been highlighted on this panel. What is it that's possible, and how can what more can be done to make the youth voice more influential in processes at home?
Je pense que, comme ça a été dit par Bobi Wine tout à l'heure, la communauté internationale a, de mon point de vue dans tous les cas, et j'ai dit que j'allais être naïf tout à l'heure, a une véritable responsabilité sur ce qui se passe sur le continent africain. Moi, je voulais remercier Aïcha pour la sagesse de ses propos, parce qu'il faut écouter ce qui est dit. Donc, il y a l'envie de s'investir, il y a l'envie de participer, il y a l'envie de faire. Mais c'est vrai que le cadre et le contexte, et ça a été dit tout à l'heure, donc, n'est pas adapté. Et lorsque je dis ça, ça veut dire que, finalement, dans un continent, l'Afrique, qui est le continent le plus riche des continents donc, au monde, et dans ce même continent où on a la population la plus pauvre, on ne peut pas ne pas s'interroger, finalement, de ce qui est en train de se passer sur ce continent-là. Est-ce que la communauté internationale, et je le dis de façon un petit peu posée, donc, a intérêt donc, à ce que l'Afrique devienne véritablement un continent démocratique? Et ça, à l'écoute et à la lecture de ce que je vois et ce que je lis et ce que j'entends, je m'interroge fondamentalement. Et ça a été dit finalement par vos propos tout à l'heure sur un exemple très, très précis de ce que vous vivez donc, en Ouganda. Et ça, c'est une question. J'ai envie de me dire de façon beaucoup plus brutale, finalement, je m'interroge de savoir à qui profite le crime. C'est ça que je veux dire. Et c'est pour ça qu'il y a un espace majeur sur les nouveaux types de partenariat à construire. Et si nous sommes ici dans un débat organisé par la famille social-démocrate et la famille progressiste au niveau européen, ce n'est pas le fait du hasard. Parce que nous sommes une famille politique qui croyons à la démocratie, qui croyons à la parole partagée, au contrat, au véritable partenariat. Mais au partenariat non faussé. C'est-à-dire qu'on fixe un objectif, on se met ensemble autour d'une table, on signe un contrat, on le met en œuvre et on évalue. Si je dirais la communauté internationale, puisque vous m'interrogez, avait cette sagesse-là, donc peut-être que nous n'en serions pas là à l'échelle du continent africain. Et si le monde, finalement, depuis maintenant plus de 40 ans, qui s'est libéralisé, où le sens du commun a disparu, où l'intérêt collectif a disparu, où les partenariats ont disparu, où on a exacerbé l'individualisme, le repli sur soi, l'intérêt personnel, la concentration des richesses pour quelques-uns, l'augmentation des pauvretés, des inégalités, parce que c'est ça le schéma à l'échelle mondiale qui est devant nous, ben peut-être qu'il faudrait revisiter, finalement, le modèle géopolitique tel que nous le connaissons aujourd'hui. Et certes, il y a des problèmes de gouvernance sur le continent africain, mais il y a aussi des problèmes et des questions de gouvernance à l'échelle mondiale. Et je crois que c'est ça les questions qui nous sont posées en tant que responsables politiques aujourd'hui à l'échelle communautaire et européenne. On peut inventer des outils, les outils existent, on peut créer des conseils municipaux de jeunes, des conseils de communautés de jeunes, des conseils à l'échelle nationale ou internationale de jeunes pour sensibiliser. Mais si en amont, le choix d'une véritable démocratisation du continent, mais réelle, une démocratie légitime donc, n'est pas mise en œuvre, je pense que ça ne sera que du verbiage finalement et du langage qui ne s'inscrira pas dans une dure réalité. Ce qui a été dit et demandé et revendiqué, je le crois, à travers les propos d'Aïcha, c'est que les jeunes ont besoin d'une traduction concrète. Ils sont dans l'attente maintenant. Et que s'investir dans la vie du quotidien et dans la vie politique, ça doit donner lieu à une vision d'espoir, à une vision que la parole portée, l'action mise en œuvre se traduira dans la réalité concrète du quotidien. Et je crois que c'est là-dessus que nous devons inventer. Donc d'abord accepter et faire l'évaluation, ce que je considère être un échec des liens entre le continent européen et le continent africain aujourd'hui, globalement, j'ai envie de dire, parce qu'aujourd'hui, on ne peut pas continuer à tolérer des situations telles que nous les connaissons aujourd'hui. Donc, il faut arrêter de parler de partenariat, donc, parce que c'est virtuel. Finalement, il y a de l'intérêt, donc, d'une certaine partie de la communauté internationale par rapport au continent africain. Moi, je considère que nous sommes en échec, donc il faut l'évaluer, analyser pourquoi et mettre en œuvre des nouveaux types de partenariats. Et malheureusement, je ne crois pas que des continents comme le continent chinois ou les Russes aujourd'hui amènent des solutions nouvelles sur le continent africain. Je crois qu'en responsabilité, au regard de nos histoires communes qui sont quelquefois douloureuses, nous devons accepter la situation aujourd'hui, l'analyser et se mettre en perspective, mais avec des vraies visions démocratiques. Et si l'on est ensemble empreinte d'humilité, avec la volonté de considérer que le développement humain et les droits sont une clé majeure sur laquelle nous ne devons pas lâcher, je pense que nous pourrons imaginer un avenir serein pour le continent africain et les partenariats à venir entre le continent européen et le continent africain. Dans tous les cas, je crois pouvoir dire ici, mais Marek, mon collègue et vice-président, le dira mieux que moi tout à l'heure, que c'est dans cet état d'esprit que la famille social-démocrate et progressiste s'inscrit. Elle est consciente des limites du modèle libéral, elle est consciente des limites de ce que nous avons produit jusqu'à présent et qu'il faut qu'on parte sur des nouvelles visions, des nouveaux partenariats dans lesquels les quêtes du sens, la quête du commun, la quête de l'épanouissement et du développement au sens étymologique du terme soient de véritables objectifs et que nous puissions ensemble les mettre en œuvre. Non plus penser dominant-dominé, mais penser partenariat au sens premier du terme, c'est-à-dire qu'on s'enrichit mutuellement. Et je veux revenir, pour conclure mon propos, sur cette notion d'arbre par l'arbre. Moi, je crois beaucoup à ça. Je crois beaucoup à ce que le développement passe par 10 cerveaux qui se réunissent, non pas qu'un cerveau qui pense pour les autres. Donc, mettons-nous ensemble, ayons l'humilité de notre vécu commun, donc, et de nos échecs communs, et essayons d'avancer pour l'intérêt du plus grand nombre. Voilà ce que je voulais rajouter à la question que vous m'avez posée.
Thank you. I think that Eric said a few profound things, but I'd just like to highlight two things. First of all, redefining or expanding the scope of democratization, because I think there's token democracies where you have elections and that's it, but you don't take care to be sure that the voices in the elections are equal. But I like the fact that you've highlighted that we need to move from just having democracy by elections to true democratization. There's equality of voices and that the governments that result from those elections are representative of the population. But also, you pointed out that between Europe and Africa, we need to transition to a true partnership, a partnership of equals, that we move from just talking about partnership to actually action about partnerships. And I think this is a good point to bring in Ms. Kesani again from South Africa, because I heard from her earlier, she sounded a bit despondent and expressed how young people in South Africa are withdrawing from the process because their voices don't make a difference. And it highlighted the power asymmetry and the extreme power asymmetry between those who hold power in South Africa and in much of Africa as well, between those who hold power and those who don't. There's extreme power asymmetry. And the thing about power asymmetry is that, nothing really happens unless it's acted on by an external force. So I'm just going to ask you, Ms. Kesani, if you think that the international community has a role to play in making your voice more influential in Africa. And if they do, what is most needed? Where is the most help needed in your situation? But also you can speak for the rest of Africa if you have that ability. Ms. Kesani.
So I think first and foremost, it's just maybe important for me to state this, that I'm a human rights attorney, and when you actually read legislation and you see how South Africa has international obligations, right, towards its citizens and everybody else that lives in South Africa, And when you look at the setup of human rights committees and how their recommendations are not binding, right? It makes it seem like there's actually no justice whatsoever. So even if and we report this to human rights committees, nothing will be done because they'll just say, oh, Mr. President, please be nice to these people. So I'm in civil society. We continuously litigate against the government to compel them to listen to the people and take them into consideration and actually implement their policies, but nothing actually gets done at the end of the day. So I also think that as Africa and Africans, we need to also try and look for African solutions for African problems. And that's something that could actually help. So I think getting human rights committees' recommendations to be binding, like legally binding, with actual sanctions to be imposed on the actual country, I think that's a step in the right direction. Because we had COVID relief funds squandered by the government. People are even poorer. People have lost their jobs. People have lost everything. So if the international committee or international societies are helping South Africa with anything, there actually has to be policies in place and agreements in place to ensure that the money actually goes to the people that it said it's going to go for and uplift the lives that it's actually supposed to uplift. So I think they could apply the pressure in terms of that, putting the pressure that they need that monitoring and evaluation to be done whenever they get any sort of assistance. But also, I think it's also important to mention from what Eric was saying that relationships between South Africa or Africa and Europe shouldn't just be relationships of exploitation, but should be relationships that are to the benefit of both parties, that are equal, and actually achieve substantive equality, especially in the context of African people, considering where we find ourselves today economically and socially. So I think that's something that's very, very important. Having legislation or having committees and their recommendations to be binding, and ensuring that sanctions are in place if our government doesn't do anything. Also, I don't think there's anything wrong with actually imposing restrictions to say that at least 80% of people on certain forums, on certain committees have to be young people, right? And actually give them the power and the influence, because most people, like, I'd be put as a Black female director of a company, but I might not be the one that's actually making all the main decisions, right? I'm just there as a face or as a trophy. So we need to find ways to do away with those kind of things, and that kind of narrative is that, yes, there are young people in our National Assembly, but what's their power? They're just there as a tick box exercise. But what's actually their power? What's actually their influence? And how far does it actually go? And also, how do we also strengthen civil society in our countries, right? Because if we are not properly or fully funded, we are unable to actually go head on with our governments whenever they fail us, right? So I think it's very important to just also ensure that there's support for civil society who are actually trying, whose their existence is to hold governments accountable for everything that they do, and ensuring that there's actual sanctions in place, and not just something where it just affects one person, but also what is the impact of the actions or agreements that South Africa enters into? What is the impact on the people on the ground, the most vulnerable, the most marginalized?
Thank you, Kisani. So what I'm hearing from you is, sanctions, actual sanctions for actions that, affect abuses of human rights, but also things that suppress the voice of the youth, actions from government that suppress the voice of the youth. These violations should actually attract real sanctions. There's also the need to strengthen support for civil society, because that appears to give the platform for young people to influence policy as well. So stronger support for civil society organizations, particularly youth-led civil society organizations. And I think that was what was exemplified by Not Too Young to Run in Nigeria, that received support and were able to impact policy. So I'm going to turn to Mohammed Ravat, who's in the studio with us. He's a youth activist. And I would just like to ask you to respond to this debate.
Right. So I think before I say anything, I just want to say it's such a huge honour to share a platform with Bobby. I've just been listening to what you've said. It's quite easy for us to sit here in Brussels and talk about democracy. It's a very different story being on the ground in the, in front of a military dictatorship and then pushing for those values. That is something. So I salute your determination. I salute your bravery. I salute your resilience. And it's an inspiration for all of us sitting here. It goes to show that if we're not careful, we could all slide into similar situations. So I think right at the outset, that's something that, I wanted to say. Yeah, I've been listening to all the different contributions that have been given. And I'd just like to say, I want to reflect on quite a few of them. If we are going to have a smooth transition of power from existing leaders to the next generation, I think one of the things we need to address is we need to have a credible alternative. And that alternative doesn't just exist, it needs to be created. I think what we see with Africa is, there's strongman politics. So the leadership, the presidency kind of revolves around one particular person. We don't really look at the team that's under them. And if we want to have a credible opposition, someone, an opposition that's ready for power, an opposition that looks like a credible alternative to the public, then we need to create that credible alternative. And I think this is where the international community comes in. Because we need to go onto the ground and we need to look at the opposition parties, and rather than just creating one single individual who becomes the figurehead of a movement, we need to ensure that there is an entire team under there, that the moment they come into power, they are able to begin delivering almost immediately. So they need to hit the ground running. And this is quite important because if we have an elections in one state, and if there is a change of power, and if the people of the eyes of the world will be watching when that transition happens. If it's not smooth, then it's unlikely that this will catch on. But if there's one successful example where there is a successful change of power and they're able to hit the ground running, then this will serve as a springboard in different states. So let's look at Zambia, where we had a change of government last year. President Hakainde Hichilema had been running for elections since 2006, and after many attempts last year, he finally made it through. It took about 3 or 4 weeks for his cabinet to take shape. So when I look back and I reflect at this, here is a man who had been in opposition for 16 years. I do feel that some of that time should have been utilized to have a movement that is ready almost immediately. But what happened is over that entire period, the focus was on one individual, and that is how it seems to work in Africa. But what happens is when you then come into power, you don't have that alternative structure ready underneath. So I think that the international community, if we want to support change in Africa, one of the things we absolutely need to do is we need to start building that alternative. We can't just talk about democracy. We can't just focus on individuals. We need to ensure that there's a broader movement underneath. And I think this is the perfect time to capitalize on that. We're looking at what's happening in the Sahel region. Dictatorships are on the rise. And if we look at the reasons behind that, there's Africans, for many years, it's only been platitudes. We've given loads and loads of platitudes. We support democracy, we support this, we support that. But how much of that has actually trickled down to the public? And that's where, there's a huge frustration. And that's why we're saying, we saw in Burkina Faso when the coup happened a week or two ago, there wasn't a massive uprising. There wasn't that much sadness on the ground. There was some show of celebration, some show of support, which for me was quite frustrating. I felt like democracy has collapsed, and rather than the public, there being some sort of an outcry, these people are celebrating. And we need to understand the reasons behind this. So if we truly want to help Africa, reach its true potential, I think it's got to be a broader conversation. We need to do much more, and Europe especially. I think we need to really go back and realize that the way we left Africa, a lot of the problems that are there today, they are rooted in the manner in which we left. And Europe as a, as a continent, as a people, we need to accept that we have, more than a huge part to play in fixing a problem that we created.
Well, thank you, Mohammed, for that very interesting contribution. I actually liked a whole lot of what you said, especially about shifting the focus from individuals to actually building structures and sustainable movements. I think that word, sustainable, is important. That's something that outlasts a single individual, that moves, if you incapacitate a single person, you don't stop the movement because, it has so many leaders. And I think that it's something that young people have started learning in Africa, of having leaderless movements, because they see how government targets the leaders of the movements. Well, I think that those kinds of movements may be difficult to support, but I think that we need to figure out how to support the broader kinds of the new kinds of movements that are emerging out of young people in Africa. So I'm going to talk to Bobby Wine now, because we're talking about young people getting involved. I also want to talk about young people supporting young people, because again, this is a conversation that's it's been happening in Africa. Young people coming to the polls and becoming candidates and so on. Now, assuming that we solve the problem of youth voter apathy, which, for instance, we've heard from Kisani in South Africa about what's happening with apathy, but assuming we solve that problem, how confident are you that young people can back young people? Will young people vote young people into office, or will we go back to a situation where we're bringing in people that should have transitioned to younger leaders? And how do we manage that? How do we navigate that?
Thank you very much. We have looked so much at the young people, but like one speaker said, that the young people of today were the babies of yesterday, and will certainly be the elders of tomorrow. We happen to be living in a generation where there's not so much difference in the minds, the young and the old, the male and the female. We tend to share understanding to look at things largely the same, because what is right to the young and to the old, and what is wrong to the young and to the old. So for the young people, it's just the numbers and the shared aspirations and the shared pains, but largely we look at the same wrongs and the same rights. However, allow me to go back a little bit and mention that while we are discussing the continent of Africa, especially from here in Europe, I would rather that we focus on the realities. It would be very naive for us to discuss Africa from the lenses of a comfortable European. Let's look at Africa through the lens of an African, and look at the Africa-Europe partnership and define it. Is it a partnership in crime or a partnership in the rule of law? Is it a partnership in democracy or a partnership in autocracy? Is it a partnership in good or the partnership in wrong? Is it a partnership in development or a partnership in underdevelopment? And looking at that, I think it's important for us not just to look at the leaders. Well, everything rises and falls with leadership, but let's look at the people. We look at the people of Europe and the people of Africa and look at them as equals, as human beings, and look at them as deserving the same standard of democracy, the same standard of human rights, and the same standard of respect for the rule of law. Of course, while we have progressive African countries like Zambia, which we look at so much, we look up to so much, countries like Botswana and many others which we look up to so much, we must not forget that there are blatant examples like recently Burkina Faso, countries like Chad, countries like Mali, where there's been blatant disrespect of democracy, but in very neat suits. We see European leaders seemingly condoning that, not criticizing that, and that is to the detriment of Africa. We look at countries like Cameroon. I was looking at the African Cup of Nations, where the head of state in Cameroon can barely walk, where they have to walk to him to hand over the trophy. And that's a shame to Africa. And that is something that Europe must not be seen to be part of. Countries like Uganda, where I come from, where last year, on the 18th and 19th of November, more than 150 people were massacred in broad daylight for peacefully protesting. But the world looked and kept silent. In Uganda today, pictures, images are coming out from Uganda where the son of the president will tweet and somebody will retweet disagreeing with him, and that prolific writer called Kakwenza will be picked and whipped, slave trade style. The images that used to come from the slaves of the 17th and 18th century will show up now, and the international community is just going to look at that. What kind of partnership are we having? We have an Africa today, in particular Uganda, where just yesterday the Speaker of Parliament was flown out of the country to get medical attention, but it cost the taxpayer $500,000 just to airlift the Speaker of Parliament and many other things. So in an Africa where it is acceptable for the leaders to seek medical attention outside the country, to have properties in developed democracies, properties bought with corruption, I think that partnership needs to be re-evaluated. Of course, Europe is a continent that we look up to with developed democracies, with laws that are deemed such acts unacceptable. We have the global Magnitsky, which should be evoked for such. We have sanctions, which should be evoked for that, and many other things. I think that African dictators have been largely encouraged and propped up by the West. You look back in the days of Idi Amin, he was a Ugandan leader who was largely cordoned by the West until they let him go. So I think a time has come for the West to let go of the evil and disassociate itself with the evil. Then young Africa will have opportunity to meet, like I said in the beginning, that young Africans and young Europeans are first world brains, but African young people are first world brains stuck in third world countries, which wouldn't be third world countries, but have third world leaders. So until we deal with that, the entire partnership is going to be a lie. But when we deal with that, you will see every other question being answered. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby Wine. You made very strong points, and you actually even pointed out the situation in Mali and Burkina Faso. Interestingly, if we now take an average of the leadership age in West Africa, I presume that it would come down a bit. Obviously, if you're not giving young people a peaceful way to transition, what you will see is these kinds of transitions. And so these are the kinds of things we want to avoid by creating peaceful opportunities for young people to influence where their country is going. Now, we're coming towards the end of the session, and I'm very pleased that I have Mr. Marek here with us, Marek Belka, who is a member of the European Parliament. He's also the S&D Vice President, and he will be delivering concluding remarks.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the S&D Group, I'd like to thank all the participants of this workshop for sharing their knowledge and examples on best ways to advance democracy in Africa and building strong governance structures. As we can all agree, good governance is key for the sustainable development of the African continent and a stepping stone for any ambitious social agenda. And as progress is always aimed at the future, it will be up to the next generation of leaders to play a vital role in introducing reform and change to the local and regional political systems. Today's panel has served as an opportunity for dialogue between experienced policymakers and youth representatives on the best ways of initiating and achieving change. The discussed examples of good practices in the areas of safeguarding democratic processes, stakeholder engagement, especially the inclusion of the voice of young people and support for the civil society, fight for sustainable governance, and the creation of fair and inclusive political systems may be building blocks the next generation of African leaders may use to provide security, economic growth, and prosperity to their communities. I would like to thank all the panelists for sharing their insights and experience. I believe we may expect that the youth representatives from both continents who have followed our discussion today will continue the pursuit for yet new ways of advancing democracy, cooperation, and sustainable growth for the benefit of both Africa and Europe. You may count on the support of the S&D Group and other progressive forces in this endeavor. And finally, I would like to remind you all that this panel is part of the S&D Africa Week, which continues today and tomorrow with further interesting workshops, discussions and events. I invite you all to follow these events on the Socialists and Democrats website. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member of Parliament, Marek Belka, for these concluding remarks. And I'd also like to join him to thank all the wonderful speakers we've had in the room, as well as online, contributing to this conversation. Please stay tuned to the Africa Week as it continues. The next event will be at 1:30, and that will be the opening of the digital exhibition, Communalis, a perspective for the future of infrastructure in Africa. You can check out this exhibition. You can join us online. It's an exciting exhibition. It's hosted at the ULB Fab Lab, Brussels. It's a mixed media installation by Senami Kofi, in collaboration with the Social Democrats Group, S&D Group. So be sure to check it out. And then from 2 p.m. to 2:30, please join me again for another exciting conversation. This time, we'll be talking about the climate emergency between EU and Africa, and how these two continental partners can work together to promote green innovation for people and nature. Ciao.